So today we're going to be talking about renal tubular acidosis. There is a type 1, a type 2, and a type 4. There is no type 3. Type 1 is a problem of hydrogen secretion. That is, movement of hydrogen from the blood into filtrate. You can remember this by hydrogen being the number 1 element on the periodic table. So type 1 for the first element of the periodic table. Renal tubular acidosis. Now, renal tubular acidosis type 2 is a problem with bicarb reabsorption. So remember, the other is that there was too much hydrogen in the blood. Now there's not enough bicarb in the blood, hence the blood is acidotic. For bicarb, you can remember this as type 2 because 2 and bi meaning 2. For RTA type 4, this is a problem of hypoaldosteronism. So in this can either be true hypoaldosteronism or problems with aldosterone binding. Now remember, aldosterone's job is to work on the distal convoluted tubule, and it retains fluid in the vascular space by absorbing sodium in exchange for pumping in to the filtrate potassium and hydrogen. So you can remember type 4 hyperaldosteronism as aldosterone. Now let's draw this out. We're going to draw the basic. So let's draw this out. Let's start with the glomerulus, the proximal convoluted tubule, which then turns into the descending and ascending limbs of the loop of Henle, and the distal convoluted tubule. So just so we have more time to see them in their right spot, let's put RTA type 2 at the proximal convoluted tubule and RTA1 here distally. You can think of this as being in the ascending limb or of the loop of Henle, or sort of also the distal convoluted tubule. Now here, I'm going to label this kind of special area here as RTA4. Now the reason that I have this special area labeled here is because, if you remember, RTA4 is associated with aldosterone binding, and the zona glomerulosa and macula densa are around here, and this is where aldosterone is produced, or binds to. Renin is produced, aldosterone binds to this side. So with type 2 being a problem where bicarb is not able to make it back into the blood, You can think of this as being heavily affected by drugs. So think of carbonic anhydrase inhibitors being a major cause. Now if you look at RTA1, this is a problem where in the blood, hydrogen atoms are overaccumulating because they don't have the ability to get into the cell. Now, this can be for several reasons. Mainly, or heavily tested at least, autoimmune disorders. This includes, Sjogren, lupus, and RA, to name a few. Now you can think of these as, since they're autoimmune disorders, these are antibody mediated. Antibodies are in the blood, so they're binding from the blood side and preventing things from getting in. So this is impaired hydrogen secretion. Now one other thing that can cause a type 1 RTA is hypercalciuria, so too much calcium in the urine. So in the filtrate, this extra calcium can push out extra hydrogen, and you get this sort of back leak of hydrogen into the blood. So if you ever hear just distal renal tubular acidosis, they're referring to type 1. Now, there is another distal renal tubular acidosis, which is type 4, and as we spoke about before, this is, mostly caused by aldosterone binding. Now, although I said that drugs, have mostly an effect on the proximal convoluted tubule, any aldosterone binding, aldosterone site binding drugs, so some of the potassium sparing diuretics like triamterene and amiloride, can cause a type 4 renal tubular acidosis. And typically this is going to be called distal hyperkalemic RTA. So you're going to have decreased ability for sodium to leave and decreased ability for potassium to go into the filtrate. So in the blood, you're going to have hyperkalemia. So let's review what this means in more of like a table format. So if we have type 1, type 2, type 4, remember type 1 is first element of the periodic table, hydrogen. So with too much hydrogen in the blood, you're going to have a low. So let's do this in more of a table format. So we have our type 1, type 2, and type 4. So let's take a look at this. Some differentiating factors. Let's look at the bicarbonate levels. So which one of these causes a decrease in bicarbonate in the blood? That would be number 2, bicarb. So then serum bicarb levels are going to be low or high? Low. Usually, like less than 10. Now, in this kind of 10 to 20 range, it's a little bit iffy. So we can say, 10 to 20, and then for type 4, this is usually, your bicarb is really going to stay above the 15 range. It's not going to go too low because this acts so distal, but there's not really any effect on serum bicarb. And then we look at potassium. So which one of these has an increase in serum potassium? That's the distal hyperkalemic. Sorry, that's my dad sending me a message. And so we're going to have high serum potassium in type 4 and normal potassium in types 1 and 2. Now, type 1, this is the one with hydrogen secretion issues. So because hydrogen is not being secreted into the urine pH is going to be alkaline. So urine pH is going to be greater than 5.5. In types 2 and 3, the pH is going to be significantly lower than that.